Most people think judgment is information. They believe that when someone criticizes them, that criticism reveals something true about who they are. But that is rarely how judgment actually works. Real judgment is much darker than people imagine, because most of what people criticize in you has almost nothing to do with you at all. Carl Jung once wrote that everything that irritates us about others can lead us to an understanding of ourselves. But what he didn't say directly is that most people will spend their entire lives criticizing in you the exact thing they buried in themselves. At first, nothing dramatic happens. You simply start noticing a pattern. The friend who mocks your ambition has quietly abandoned their own. The colleague who calls you arrogant is terrified of being invisible. The relative who accuses you of changing too much has spent years too afraid to change at all. And slowly a disturbing realization begins to form. Most criticism is not about you. It is a confession, disguised as an observation, spoken by someone who does not yet understand what they are actually revealing. Jung believed the human mind contains a shadow, the rejected parts of ourselves buried beneath social conditioning. Most people imagine the shadow as anger, cruelty, or violence. But sometimes the shadow is your ambition. Sometimes it is your intelligence. Sometimes it is simply your willingness to try something other people were too afraid to attempt. The parts of yourself that other people cannot tolerate are often the exact parts they were forced to abandon in themselves. And the terrifying part is this. Human beings rarely announce what they have suppressed. They project it outward instead, dressed up as concern, as advice, as harmless teasing, as brutal honesty. This is why the harshest judgment often arrives disguised as helpfulness. Someone tells you that you are being unrealistic while quietly protecting the unrealistic compromises they made with their own life. Someone warns you that confidence looks arrogant while secretly resenting a confidence they never allowed themselves to feel. They are not lying to you. They genuinely believe what they are saying. That is what makes projection so dangerous. It rarely feels like an attack from the outside. It feels like truth. People don't judge your weakness. They judge the possibility that you might outgrow them. And somewhere in the silence of your own life, you already know exactly which relationships tighten the moment you begin succeeding. That awareness is where the real understanding begins. Not with defensiveness, with recognition. There is a moment that happens quietly inside certain people. No confrontation, no dramatic argument, just a strange shift in perception. They begin noticing how often criticism arrives at the exact moment they start improving. The comment about your new schedule arrives right after you finally commit to discipline. The joke about your ambition arrives right after you finally admit what you actually want. None of this is a coincidence. It is a nervous system responding to a mirror it did not ask to look into. Jung called the persona the mask people construct to function inside society. And most people forget it is a mask long before they ever confront what lies beneath it. This is why so many individuals become uncomfortable around someone who refuses to wear one. The mind that has spent years suppressing its own desire cannot casually witness someone else pursuing theirs without some kind of internal disturbance. That disturbance rarely announces itself honestly. It disguises itself as concern for your well-being, as realism about your chances, as loyalty to the old version of you that felt safer to be around. Jung understood something darker about this dynamic. He believed that what we cannot accept in ourselves, we are almost always doomed to encounter in others, either as attraction or as intense irritation. This is why some people cannot stop thinking about someone they claim to dislike. Their nervous system is not reacting to indifference. It is reacting to a reflection. The person they criticize the most is often unknowingly showing them exactly what they gave up somewhere along the way. Think about how differently people react to the same behavior, depending on who is doing it. A stranger's confidence goes unnoticed. A friend's sudden confidence gets mocked. A stranger's ambition seems admirable from a distance. A sibling's identical ambition feels threatening up close. Proximity changes everything, because judgment is rarely about the behavior itself. It is about how uncomfortably that behavior reflects an abandoned possibility in the person judging it. This is why family members often react most intensely to personal growth. They were present for the earlier, smaller version of you, the version that matched their own limitations comfortably. Watching that version disappear forces an uncomfortable question underneath the surface of their mind. If they managed to change, why haven't I? Most people never consciously ask themselves that question. Instead, the discomfort leaks out sideways as criticism, as distance, as subtle discouragement disguised as concern. Jung believed the unconscious speaks in symbols and behavior long before it ever speaks in words. Nobody announces, "Your growth frightens me," because it exposes my own stagnation. Instead, they say, "You've changed," in a tone that somehow makes change sound like betrayal. They say, "Don't get ahead of yourself," while quietly protecting the version of the world where nobody around them ever does. This is not always malicious. Most projection is unconscious. People are rarely aware that their criticism is a mirror rather than a verdict. That is exactly what makes it so convincing, and exactly what makes it so important to understand rather than absorb. Watch how this plays out inside a workplace, because professional environments are one of the most fertile grounds for projection disguised as feedback. A colleague who works far below their potential often becomes strangely invested in keeping others at the same pace. They call your extra effort excessive. They call your new ideas impractical. They call your willingness to stay late unhealthy, framing their discomfort as concern for your work-life balance, when in reality your effort is quietly exposing the ceiling they built for themselves years ago. This is rarely a conscious strategy. Most people do not wake up deciding to sabotage a colleague's growth. Their nervous system simply registers your progress as a threat to the comfortable equilibrium they have settled into. And the mind, desperate to protect that equilibrium, manufactures a reasonable-sounding justification for discouraging you. Concern is one of the most convincing disguises the unconscious ever invented, because it allows judgment to masquerade as kindness. The same pattern appears inside families with even greater intensity, because family systems are built on decades of unspoken agreements about who is allowed to change and who is expected to stay the same. The sibling who was always considered the responsible one may quietly resent, watching you take a risk they were never permitted to take. The parent who sacrificed personal ambition for stability may feel an inexplicable tension watching you pursue something they abandoned long ago, and that tension often comes out as unsolicited warnings, exaggerated worry, or a sudden interest in reminding you of every reason your plan might fail. None of this necessarily comes from malice. Much of it comes from grief, an unconscious mourning for a version of their own life that never had permission to exist. But grief expressed as discouragement can quietly reshape an entire family's tolerance for individual growth, training each new generation to shrink before anyone even realizes. Shrinking has become the family's silent rule, the judgment that arrives wrapped in praise. "You are so patient," people say, right up until your patience becomes inconvenient for them. "You are so easygoing," they say, right up until you stop agreeing with something that costs you peace of mind. These compliments were never really about honoring your character. They were quietly training you to remain predictable. Compliance disguised as flattery is one of the oldest psychological patterns in human relationships, and it works precisely because it feels good to receive. But underneath the warmth of that praise sits a quiet expectation: stay exactly as agreeable as you are right now, because your agreeableness is convenient for me. The moment that agreeableness shifts, even slightly, the praise disappears and criticism takes its place instantly, revealing what the compliment was actually protecting all along. Understanding projection changes the way you experience criticism permanently. It does not mean every piece of feedback is secretly about someone else's insecurity. Genuine feedback exists, and dismissing all criticism as projection is its own kind of self-deception, a way of avoiding legitimate growth by hiding behind psychology. The real skill is learning to tell the difference. Genuine feedback focuses on specific behavior and usually arrives with some form of care attached to it. Projection focuses on identity, arrives with unusual intensity, and often appears exactly when you begin doing something the other person secretly wishes they were doing themselves. Genuine feedback wants you to improve. Projection wants you to stop quietly so the comparison disappears. Jung believed that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will direct your life, and you will call it fate. This applies just as much to the people around you as it applies to yourself. Someone who constantly discourages your ambition without realizing why is not consciously trying to sabotage you. They are unconsciously protecting a version of reality where their own unfulfilled potential never has to be confronted directly. This is why understanding projection requires a strange kind of compassion alongside clarity. The person criticizing your growth is often in genuine psychological pain, quietly grieving a version of themselves they never allowed to exist. That pain does not obligate you to shrink yourself to comfort them, but understanding it removes the sting of taking their words personally. Their criticism was never really a verdict on your worth. It was a symptom of their own unresolved history. Once you begin recognizing this pattern, something shifts permanently in how you experience other people's opinions. You stop absorbing every comment as fact. You start asking a quieter, more useful question instead. Is this feedback about my actual behavior, or is this a mirror reflecting something the other person has never confronted in themselves? That single question changes everything, because it removes the automatic authority other people's judgment used to hold over your identity. Their words no longer arrive as verdicts. They arrive as information about the speaker, which you are free to examine and just as free to set down. This recognition rarely feels comfortable in the beginning. It feels isolating, because once you stop absorbing every judgment personally, certain relationships begin revealing exactly how conditional they always were. People who only felt comfortable around your self-doubt begin feeling unsettled by your clarity. People who quietly relied on your insecurity to feel superior begin feeling threatened by your confidence. This does not mean everyone who criticizes you is projecting. It means projection is far more common than most people are willing to admit, especially inside the relationships that feel closest to them. Family, old friendships, long-term partnerships, all of them can become quiet containers for unspoken envy disguised as concern, discouragement disguised as protection, and criticism disguised as honesty. There is also a quieter form of projection worth understanding, the difference between envy and admiration, because the two can look almost identical from the outside, while meaning something completely different underneath. Admiration inspires people to grow. Someone who admires your discipline often becomes more disciplined themselves, using your example as proof that change is possible. Envy does the opposite. It convinces people that your success somehow diminishes their own worth, and instead of using you as inspiration, they use you as a target. This is why the same achievement can produce two completely different reactions from two different people standing in the same room. One person feels motivated, the other feels threatened. The achievement did not change between them. Their relationship with their own unlived potential did. Learning to notice which reaction someone is having toward you, admiration or envy, tells you almost everything you need to know about how safe that relationship actually is for your growth. People who admire you will ask how you did it. People who envy you will ask why you think you're better than everyone else, even when you never said anything of the kind. People who admire you celebrate quietly and sometimes loudly. People who envy you minimize your effort, attribute your success to luck, or suddenly discover a long list of reasons your achievement doesn't count the way it should. None of this requires confrontation. It simply requires observation, because behavior under these conditions reveals far more honestly than words ever could. Not because they hate you, but because your progress exposes a question they have spent years avoiding. Could I have done this too? That question is unbearable for a mind that has already decided its limitations are permanent, so instead of asking it honestly, the mind redirects the discomfort outward, onto you, in the form of judgment. Jung would call this a failure of individuation, a refusal to separate one's identity from inherited fear, from collective expectation, from the unlived potential quietly passed down through families and social circles that reward compliance and punish anyone who dares to become something different. Recognizing projection in others eventually forces you to examine it in yourself as well, and this is the part most people avoid. If judgment is often a mirror, then your own irritation towards certain people deserves the same scrutiny you have learned to apply to theirs. The person who annoys you disproportionately, the trait you criticize most intensely in others, the behavior that provokes an emotional reaction far larger than the situation seems to warrant. These are worth examining honestly, not because every irritation hides a suppressed desire, but because some of them do, and the mind that refuses to check is the mind most likely to be controlled by what it refuses to see. This is uncomfortable work, because it requires admitting that your own judgment is not always objective truth either. It requires accepting that the sharpness of your reaction to someone else's behavior sometimes says more about your own unexamined history than about the person standing in front of you. Jung believed self-knowledge was one of the most difficult achievements a person could pursue, precisely because it requires confronting the parts of yourself you worked hardest to hide. But the alternative is remaining permanently reactive, mistaking other people's projections for truth, and mistaking your own projections for insight, never realizing how much of your emotional life is actually a conversation with your own unexamined shadow. Jung believed the greatest burden a child must carry is the unlived life of the parent, and this idea explains far more about projection than most people realize. Parents rarely intend to pass down fear directly. Instead, they pass down caution disguised as wisdom, conformity disguised as advice, and limitation disguised as realism. A parent who never allowed themselves to dream big will often, without meaning to, discourage a child from dreaming big either, not out of cruelty, but because watching a child attempt what they themselves were too afraid to attempt creates an unbearable kind of grief. That grief rarely gets spoken honestly. It gets translated instead into warnings about instability, lectures about being practical, or a quiet discomfort whenever the child's ambition grows louder than the parent's own unlived potential. Entire generations can pass this pattern down without a single person in the family consciously choosing it. Each generation simply inherits the last one's unexamined fear and calls it guidance. This is why breaking a pattern of self-betrayal often feels like betraying the people who raised you, even when it is nothing of the sort. The discomfort you feel when a parent reacts strangely to your growth is not proof that you are doing something wrong. It is often proof that you are doing something they never had permission to do themselves. Understanding this does not require resentment toward them. It requires recognizing that their projection came from an old wound, not from an accurate assessment of your potential, and that distinguishing between the two is one of the most important skills a person can develop. There is a useful test worth applying whenever criticism arrives, especially from people close to you. Ask whether the criticism focuses on a specific, correctable behavior or whether it focuses on your identity as a whole. Ask whether it arrived calmly or whether it arrived with unusual intensity given the situation. Ask whether the timing lines up suspiciously with a moment of your own growth or success. Genuine feedback tends to survive this scrutiny easily because it was never trying to hide anything. Projection rarely survives the same scrutiny because once its timing and intensity are examined honestly, the pattern usually becomes impossible to ignore. You stop defending yourself against every piece of criticism, as if your identity depended on convincing the other person. Instead, you begin quietly observing, noticing which judgments carry genuine care and which ones carry unexamined envy, noticing which criticism wants you to grow and which criticism simply wants you to stop making someone else's stagnation visible. This clarity does not make you cold. It makes you difficult to control through guilt, difficult to manipulate through manufactured shame, and remarkably steady in rooms where other people are still performing versions of themselves designed to avoid their own reflection. Maybe understanding judgment was never about proving people wrong. Maybe it was about becoming honest enough to stop absorbing verdicts that were never really about you in the first place. Because in the end, the most psychologically free person in any room is not the one who never gets criticized. It is the one who has learned to tell the difference between a mirror and a message, and who no longer needs the room's approval to know which one they are looking at. So tell me in the comments, what is the criticism you received that you now realize was never actually about you?